what is a good list of Netflix top 10 interview questions? And I'm going to start in reverse from the most interesting interview questions to the most commonly asked. The first question would be, what do you like the most about our culture memo or the Netflix culture deck? So long story short, it's worth reading that memo at least once before your job interview as to when it comes to how to best answer this interview question. I believe that's best when you link that to your strength. So you would think, hey, what is my strength going into a job interview with Netflix? And you would try to link your strength and the story about your strength with their cultural memo, right? To be mentioned that this question exists in many shapes or forms, they could also complicate it in a way by asking you then, and what is one thing you disagree with or you would have written differently? Okay, so this would apply for more senior executive types of roles. The second question I'd like to share with you here is, what is the most difficult or painful piece of constructive feedback you have received in your career? Who gave it to you, and how did you adjust your behavior? Okay, so how do you handle feedback? This is also something they reference quite extensively in their memo, but when it comes to what's the best way to answer this interview question, at first you must take into account this is an exaggeration, the way this question is framed. They could simply frame it, tell me about the time when you received feedback from your manager. It would have been obvious this is a behavioral interview question, but they dramatized it a little bit, so maybe it sounds less intuitive because these questions are so easy to predict during these job interviews. So basically you would have to brainstorm of a time when you had done something wrong for which you had your manager or a peer provided you with some feedback which you took seriously, and you had some great learnings which you used throughout your career. To be noted here that the question is asking you for a piece of tough feedback in a professional context, because I know many candidates would have a tendency to share a story that is from extracurricular activities. That would be only my second preference going into a job interview. All right, so the third interview question I'd like to share with you here would be, tell me about the time you had to work on a project and had someone on your team who would not cooperate or had a fundamentally different approach. What did you do? So this question, the reason why they would ask you this question in a job interview with Netflix is because they want to test your interpersonal skills and even your backbone to a certain extent. The time when you had a disagreement with someone on something. And the theoretical way you answer questions around conflict would be to basically find some evidence, some data to prove your point, then to communicate, to focus on communicating that evidence with the other side with a goal to establish trust. Now, this is a simplification of how to answer conflict questions, simply because conflict means different things to different types of roles and different types of levels of roles. For example, conflict might mean, a conflict with a colleague or your manager in its most basic format, but it could also mean a time when you influenced someone or a group's decision, or it could also mean a time when you mediated a conflict between others for more senior types of roles. But depending on what conflict means to you, this is the data-driven, the evidence-driven approach, and plus the communication skills would be the best combination to answer this interview question efficiently. Question number 4, tell me about the time when you strongly disagreed with a manager's strategy, voiced your concern, but they decided to move forward with their plan anyway. How did you support that project after the decision was finalized? Okay, so this is something that Netflix references in their cultural memo, something they call the disagree, then commit. And this is not only present in Netflix cultural memo, this with many other high-performing companies. and it basically refers to your ability to commit to a decision once it's taken. So basically, this question can easily be reframed to tell me about a time when you disagreed with their manager but had to commit to their decision. And what happens here, and I can tell you that I'm role-playing this question a lot with my clients, there's a huge tendency that someone would answer this question with a time when they were right, but since their manager was their boss, they had to commit to their decision. Ultimately, the decision was wrong, and then they said, haha, I was right about this one. When in fact, the whole point of this in a job interview is to sell yourself on something. So if they ask you for a time when you committed to a decision, that decision might as well have been a good decision. For example, your manager had some insight which you probably were unaware of, or you were inexperienced about. You committed to their decision, which ultimately proved to be a great decision, and you took a lot of learnings from that type of experience. But long story short, the main approach, the successful approach to sell yourself in a job interview about your ability to commit is within a context where the decision was actually the right one, even though you disagreed with it or you were highly skeptical about it, so to speak. The next interview question, the fifth interview question I'd like to share with you here would be, can you tell me about the time when you had to move a project forward under a tight deadline despite not having all the required information or clear guardrails? Okay, so why would someone ask you about the time when you had to advance a project under a tough deadline? This would be because they want to test your ability to deliver results. Your ability to deliver results is critically important regardless of the role you're applying for with any high-performing company. It's something that they don't even have to mention, that you must prepare that, hey, I'm someone who can deliver if I get the job. Now, specifically this question, is framed in such a way that it's slightly counterintuitive in a sense that they say in a pressure context, under a tight deadline. So you would argue that, so arguably the best way to answer this question would be also to highlight your bias for action in a context of a challenging delivery. But still the main thing, would be a delivery which often boils down to unlocking that project because you found some insight, despite not having all the required information or clear guardrails, right? So if, for instance, the key thing to move forward for this project was a decision-making process, you could argue that maybe you prioritized something over something else, and this unlocked the delivery, or maybe you found some interesting insight or some interesting data that would, again, allow the project, program, or solution to be delivered successfully, right? But the main thing is that going into a job interview with a high-performing company, you should have at least one or two stories about when you delivered under ambiguous, under tough, under tight deadlines, under challenging circumstances. Right? Question number 6. Share a difficult situation that you tackled where you had to dig deeper into a complex system or cross-functional strategy because the original plan scale failed. Okay, so this is an interview question that's basically, this is what's called a deep dive. Okay, so they're asking you for something complex that you worked on because they want to test your subject matter expertise over something, over your core area of expertise going to this job interview. And the main types of projects one would try to choose here, of course, your best stories, but a challenging type of delivery, right? A challenging type of delivery where you had some complexity that you successfully navigated because your subject matter expertise allowed you to navigate that. Now, what are some pointers, that you can expect? What are some information? What is some information they would expect you to communicate while answering these questions around a complex system or cross-functional strategy? For this, you would want to look at the most commonly asked challenge and probing questions in a job interview. It's something that's called the STAR format. So probably you've heard that the best way to answer, or at least the basic way to answer behavioral interview questions, is using the STAR format. And for each of the situation and task, action, and then the results, there are possible follow-up and challenge questions. And the reason why I'm mentioning them is because if you manage to embed information from these follow-up and challenge questions throughout your stories, then they will be far more likely to be more convincing and be perceived as more genuine, to the extent you introduce only the information that makes the most sense. The seventh interview question I'd like to share with you here, that's quite common in interviews with Netflix and with high-performing companies in general, is tell me about the time when you failed. Okay, so for you, they would ask you to speak about the failure. And I can tell you from experience, this is the easiest way you'd screen someone if they prepared or not a job interview. Because if you did not prepare a job interview, it's very likely that you'll struggle and even you're going to get blocked answering this counterintuitive, slightly negative type of questions. So what's the best way to prepare? Tell me about time when you failed. Well, you would think about the shortcoming you have in your career, not one that you had too recently or not one that could damage your candidate brand, but ideally one from which you took some great learnings. So usually the best stories around failures are the ones with the best learnings. If you remember the second interview question I mentioned, at the time when you received a critical piece of feedback. So that could also be that critical piece of feedback could also be due to a failure you had. So maybe you have a bit of overlap between your stories as well, but it is important that you would also take this into account. Now, these were the top 7 most interesting interview questions, and the remaining 3 interview questions are pretty standard ones that you would expect in basically any job interview. The third one would be your strength and weakness. What's your strength and what's your weakness? And if you remember at the beginning of this list, I mentioned that in the question, what do you like the most about our memo, I would pitch that with my strength, right? So if that could be an extra reason for which you'd prepare your strength. Your weakness, even today people get away with public speaking as their weakness, so long you pitch that with a great story from which you learned something ideally. The second most commonly asked interview question with Netflix and any other high-performing company would be, why Netflix, why this role, why now? And the first one would be, tell me about yourself. And the reason why I'm mentioning these together is because I suggest you prepare these at once. In my experience, you could save yourself quite a bit of time if you prepare a great elevator pitch, you tell me about yourself, and then adapt that, maybe add a few pointers to why Netflix, why this role, and why now. But whenever you're presenting yourself, whenever you're introducing yourself in a job interview, you would also mention some motivators from which you'd want to join this company. So anyway, if you're going to trial this technique out, I'm sure you're going to understand what it means to blend these together. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.